Hello, horror lover. Are you ready for a long night of nightmares? Before we begin, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel, and especially leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I'd love to know. Click the like button, all of this because the last cardboard box hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud, sending a small cloud of dust dancing in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the bay window. I straightened up, pressing my hands against the small of my back, and let out a satisfied groan. After weeks of packing, moving, and unpacking, I was finally done. "Welcome home, Jake," I muttered to myself, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. I took a moment to survey my new living room. The old Victorian house had character, creaky floorboards, ornate moldings, and a sense of history that you just couldn't find in modern builds. It was everything I had dreamed of when I decided to leave the bustling streets of Richmond for the quiet charm of rural Virginia. As I moved to the kitchen to grab a well-deserved beer, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my sister, Kate. "Hey, stranger," I answered, wedging the phone between my ear and shoulder as I rummaged through the fridge. "What's up?" "Just checking in on my favorite brother." Kate's voice crackled through the speaker. "How's the new place? All moved in?" I popped the cap off the beer bottle and took a long swig before responding. "Just finished unpacking the last box. It's perfect, Kate. You should see it. The house, the land. It's exactly what I needed." "I'm glad, Jake. Really." There was a pause, and I could practically hear her biting her lip. "But are you sure you're okay out there all alone? It's been less than a year since—" "I'm fine," I cut her off, perhaps a bit too sharply. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but this is good for me. A fresh start, you know." Kate sighed. "I know, just don't be a stranger, okay? Call me if you need anything." "Will do. Love you, sis." "Love you too, Jake." As I ended the call, a flicker of guilt gnawed at my conscience. Kate had always been there for me, especially after the accident. But she couldn't understand. Nobody could. This move wasn't just about a change of scenery. It was about escaping the memories, the nightmares, the constant reminders of what I'd done. I shook my head, trying to dispel the dark thoughts. This was supposed to be a new beginning. I grabbed my beer and headed out to the back porch, determined to enjoy the sunset over my new property. The porch creaked under my weight as I settled into an old rocking chair. Before me, the backyard stretched out, a carpet of overgrown grass giving way to a small copse of trees at the far end. And there, about 50 yards from the house, stood the old well. It was a simple structure, a circular stone wall about 3 feet high, topped with a wooden frame supporting a small roof. A rusty bucket hung from a chain, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. There was something quaint about it, like a snapshot from another era. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the yard, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The chirping of crickets filled the air, a soothing symphony of nature. I closed my eyes, letting the tension of the past few weeks melt away. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought I had imagined it. A whisper, barely audible above the evening sounds. My eyes snapped open, scanning the darkening yard. "Hello?" I called out, feeling slightly foolish. Of course, there was no answer. I was about to chalk it up to an overactive imagination when I heard it again. This time there was no mistaking it. It was a whisper, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the well. A chill ran down my spine, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the warm summer evening. I set my beer down with a shaky hand and stood up, my eyes fixed on the well. "Is someone there?" I called out again, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet yard. The whisper came again, louder this time. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something in the tone that made my heart race. It sounded urgent, insistent. Before I knew what I was doing, I was walking across the yard, drawn to the well like a moth to a flame. The grass was damp with evening dew soaking through my socks, but I barely noticed. All my attention was focused on the stone structure before me. As I approached, the whispering grew louder, but no clearer. It was as if someone was talking just below the range of my hearing. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the stone rim of the well. It was ice cold. I jerked my hand back, startled by the unnatural chill. It had been a warm day, and the stone should have retained some of the sun's heat. This felt like touching a block of ice. "What the hell?" I muttered, rubbing my fingers together. The whispering suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The crickets had fallen quiet, and even the rustle of leaves seemed muted. The whole world was holding its breath, waiting. I leaned forward, peering into the inky blackness of the well. The last rays of sunlight didn't penetrate far, and I couldn't see the bottom. A musty, damp smell wafted up, bringing with it a hint of something else. Something metallic and vaguely familiar. "Hello?" I called down the well, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "Is anyone down there?" For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I was about to pull back, it came. "Jake." My name, clear as day, whispered from the depths of the well. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. "Who's there?" I shouted, fear and confusion warring in my mind. "How do you know my name?" The answer came not from the well, but from directly behind me, a cold whisper that felt like a knife against my ear. "I know what you did." I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance, but there was no one there. Just the darkening yard and the silent trees beyond. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I backed away from the well, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. But I was alone, or at least, I appeared to be. I turned and ran back to the house, slamming the porch door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. I leaned against it, sliding down to sit on the floor as my legs gave out. "It's not real," I told myself, running my hands through my hair. "It's not real. You're tired. You're imagining things." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The voice had been too clear, too real, and it had known my name, known what I'd done. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, every light in the house blazing, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building settling. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whisper again. "I know what you did." As the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. This house, this land, it was supposed to be a fresh start, a place to escape my past. Instead, it seemed my darkest secret had followed me here, manifesting in that God-forsaken well. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over Kate's number. She would understand, wouldn't she? She'd help me pack up, find a new place. I could make up some excuse. The house needed more work than I thought. The commute was too long. Anything but the truth. But as I was about to hit call, a new whisper filled the room. Not from outside, not from the well, but from somewhere deep inside my own mind. "You can't run from this, Jake. You can't hide. It's time to face what you've done." I let the phone slip from my fingers, clattering to the floor. The voice was right. I had been running for too long, hiding from the truth, from the consequences of my actions. Whatever was happening here, whatever force had drawn me to this place, I knew one thing for certain. My life would never be the same again. The harsh morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the living room. I blinked, disoriented, my neck stiff from a night spent curled up on the couch. For a blissful moment, I forgot where I was and why I'd slept there. Then it all came rushing back. The well, the whispers, the cold voice that knew my darkest secret. "Get it together, Jake," I muttered, rubbing my face with trembling hands. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been real. I forced myself to stand, wincing at the protest of my cramped muscles. The house was silent now, bathed in the ordinary light of day. It all seemed so normal, so mundane. How could I have let my imagination run so wild last night? As I shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee, I caught sight of my reflection in a window. Dark circles shadowed my eyes. and my usually neat beard was unkempt. I looked like a man on the edge, and I felt like one too. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with the comforting aroma of brewing coffee. I leaned against the counter, trying to make sense of what had happened. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was stress from the move, or perhaps I'd had one too many beers on an empty stomach. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured myself a large mug, inhaling the steam. As the caffeine began to work its magic, I felt my nerves settling. In the light of day, last night's terror seemed almost laughable. That's when the doorbell rang. I nearly dropped my mug, coffee sloshing over the rim and scalding my hand. Heart pounding, I approached the front door. Through the frosted glass, I could make out two figures standing on my porch. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. "Good morning," a cheerful voice greeted me. A middle-aged couple stood there, all smiles and Midwestern politeness. "We're the Johnsons. We live just down the road and wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." I blinked, momentarily stunned by this slice of normalcy. "Oh, thanks. I'm Jake Connor." The woman, a petite blonde with laugh lines around her eyes, thrust a covered dish towards me. "We brought you a casserole. Moving can be such a hassle. We thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal." That's very kind of you," I managed, accepting the dish. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. Part of me wanted to slam the door and hide, but a larger part craved human interaction, something to ground me in reality. "We'd love to," the man replied, following his wife into my living room. As I busied myself in the kitchen, fetching mugs and cream, I could hear them commenting on the house. "Oh, Frank, look at these moldings. You don't see craftsmanship like this anymore." "You've got yourself a real piece of history here, Jake," Frank called out. "This house has been standing since before the Civil War, did you know that?" I returned with the coffee, plastering on what I hoped was a convincing smile. "No, I didn't. The real estate agent mentioned it was old, but I didn't realize how old." As we settled into conversation, I found myself relaxing. The Johnsons were easy to talk to, full of local history and gossip. For a while, I almost forgot about the events of the previous night. Then Frank asked the question I'd been dreading. "So, Jake, what brought you out here to our little corner of Virginia?" I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. What could I say? That I was running from my past? That I'd killed someone and gotten away with it? I just needed a change of pace," I said finally, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. City life was getting to be too much. "Mrs. Johnson, call me Linda," she'd insisted, nodded sympathetically. "Oh, I understand completely. It's so peaceful out here." Although she leaned in conspiratorially. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you look like you haven't slept a wink. Is everything all right?" I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Just still adjusting to country living, I guess. It's so quiet at night, you know?" Frank chuckled. "Oh, you'll get used to it. Soon enough, you won't be able to sleep without the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl." As they prepared to leave, Linda paused at the door. "Oh, I almost forgot to mention, we're having a little neighborhood get-together next weekend, sort of an end-of-summer barbecue. We'd love for you to come, get to know everyone." "That sounds great," I lied, already knowing I'd find some excuse not to go. "Thanks for stopping by." As I closed the door behind them, the facade I'd been maintaining crumbled. I slumped against the wall, my heart racing. How long could I keep this up? How long before someone saw through the cracks in my carefully constructed normalcy? The rest of the day passed in a haze of forced productivity. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, anything to keep my mind occupied. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, I felt the familiar tendrils of dread creeping in. I found myself standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the well. It looked so innocuous in the fading light. Just a simple stone structure. Nothing sinister about it at all. You're being ridiculous, I told myself firmly. It was just your imagination. There's nothing out there. To prove it to myself, I decided to go out there. Just a quick walk to the well and back. Show myself there was nothing to be afraid of. The grass was cool under my bare feet as I crossed the yard. Cicadas buzzed in the trees, a chorus of summer's end. Everything was perfectly normal, until I reached the well. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as I approached. I could see my breath misting in the air despite the warm evening. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. Is anyone there?" Silence. I let out a shaky laugh. "See? Nothing. You're losing it, Jake." I turned to head back to the house, relief flooding through me. And then I heard it. "Jackie." My name, drawn out in a long, sibilant whisper. I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Who's there?" I shouted, fear and anger warring in my voice. "Show yourself." "You can't hide from what you've done, Jake," the voice whispered, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The truth will come out. It always does." "No," I moaned, clutching my head. "No, this isn't real. It can't be real." But even as I denied it, I knew. This was real. Whatever was happening, whatever force was at work here, it knew my secret. And it wasn't going to let me forget. I ran back to the house, slamming and locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I poured myself a generous measure of whiskey, downing it in one burning gulp. As the alcohol spread its numbing warmth through my body, I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. What was I going to do? I couldn't leave. Where would I go? But how could I stay here with that thing out there? I poured another drink and another, trying to drown out the voice that echoed in my head. But no matter how much I drank, I couldn't escape the truth it spoke. I had killed someone. I had taken a life and gotten away with it. And now it seemed my past had caught up with me. As the whiskey bottle emptied and my vision blurred, I found myself drawn back to the window. The well stood silent in the moonlight, a dark sentinel holding the key to my guilt. In that moment, fueled by alcohol and desperation, I made a decision. I couldn't run from this anymore. I had to face it, whatever it was. Tomorrow, I would go back to the well. I would confront this thing, this voice that knew my secret, and one way or another, I would put an end to it. As I finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep, the whisper came one last time, soft and inexorable. "See you soon, Jake. We have so much to talk about." The pounding in my head matched the insistent rapping at the front door. I groaned, peeling my face off the leather couch where I'd passed out. The living room was a mess, empty whiskey bottle on the coffee table, clothes strewn about, and the lingering stench of fear and alcohol. "Mr. Connor? Jake? Are you in there?" The voice was unfamiliar, tinged with concern. I stumbled to my feet, the room spinning slightly as I made my way to the door. Taking a deep breath, I opened it, squinting against the harsh morning light. A man in his early 50s stood on my porch, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, a look of worry etched on his face. Behind him, I could see a police cruiser parked in my driveway. "Jake Connor?" he asked, his eyes taking in my disheveled appearance. I nodded, trying to shake off the fog of my hangover. "That's me. What's this about?" He held up a badge. "I'm Sheriff Tom Hawkins. Mind if I come in? We've had some concerns from your neighbors." My stomach dropped. Had someone heard me shouting at the well last night? Or worse, had they heard the well talking back? Sure," I mumbled, stepping aside to let him in. "Sorry about the mess. I'm still settling in." Sheriff Hawkins entered, his eyes scanning the room. I saw them linger on the empty whiskey bottle, and I felt a flush of shame creep up my neck. "Mr. Connor," he began, turning to face me. "We received a call from Linda Johnson this morning. She was worried about you, said you seemed distressed when she visited yesterday, And then there were reports of shouting coming from your property last night. Is everything all right? I ran a hand through my hair, buying time as I scrambled for an explanation. I'm fine, really. Just had a bit too much to drink last night, that's all. New house, you know. Still getting used to the sounds. The sheriff nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. I understand moving can be stressful, but if there's anything you need to talk about... Really, I'm fine, I insisted, perhaps a bit too forcefully. I appreciate the concern, but it won't happen again. I promise. Sheriff Hawkins held my gaze for a long moment before nodding. All right then. But Jake, we're a small community here. We look out for each other. If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. As I closed the door behind him, relief washed over me, quickly followed by a wave of nausea. I barely made it to the bathroom before emptying the meager contents of my stomach. Leaning against the cool porcelain of the toilet, I closed my eyes, but the darkness only brought back memories of the night before. The well, the whispers, the crushing weight of my guilt. Pull yourself together, I muttered, forcing myself to stand. I needed to clear my head, to think rationally about what was happening. After a long, hot shower and 2 cups of strong coffee, I felt marginally more human. I stood at the kitchen window staring out at the well. In the bright light of day, it looked harmless, almost quaint. But I knew better. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside. The late summer air was heavy with humidity, cicadas buzzing in the trees. Each step towards the well felt like moving through molasses, my body fighting against the direction my mind was taking it. As I approached, the air grew cooler, just like before. I steeled myself, placing my hands on the rough stone of the well's rim. All right, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I'm here, what do you want from me? For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, as if carried on a non-existent breeze, I heard it. Remember, Jake? Remember what you did? The words hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly, I was no longer standing in my backyard. I was back on that rain-slicked road 5 years ago, my hands gripping the steering wheel, music blaring from the speakers. I could smell the alcohol on my breath, see the rain streaking across the windshield. And there, suddenly illuminated in my headlights, was a figure crossing the road. No, I whispered, but I couldn't stop the memory from unfolding. The screech of tires, the sickening thud, the moment of stunned silence before panic set in. I saw myself getting out of the car, approaching the still form on the road. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky as rain fell on her face. Blood pooled beneath her, mixing with the rainwater. Oh God, I heard myself say. Oh God, no. Please, no. But she didn't move. She didn't blink. She was gone, and I had killed her. The memory shifted, and I was back in my car, driving away from the scene, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I saw myself pulling into my garage, inspecting the damage to my car. The dent in the hood, the crack in the windshield. I watched as I meticulously cleaned the car, erasing all evidence of what I'd done. I saw myself rehearsing my story. I'd been home all night, hadn't gone out at all. The damage to the car must have happened in the parking lot at work, probably some hit and run. The images faded, and I found myself back in the present, on my knees before the well, tears streaming down my face. Why? I choked out. Why are you showing me this? Because you need to remember, the well whispered. You need to face what you've done. I remember, I shouted, anger suddenly flaring. I remember every damn day. Do you think I've forgotten? Do you think I don't see her face every time I close my eyes? Then why haven't you confessed? The well asked, its voice maddeningly calm. Why do you continue to live your life as if nothing happened? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Why hadn't I confessed? Fear, certainly. Fear of prison, of losing everything I'd worked for. But it was more than that. I can't, I whispered. It's too late. It's been too long. It's never too late to tell the truth, Jake, the well said. But every day you wait, the weight of your guilt grows heavier. I stood up, my legs shaky. What do you want from me? What are you? I am the voice of your conscience, Jake, the well replied. I am the truth you've been running from, and I won't be silenced any longer. I stumbled back towards the house, my mind reeling. As I reached the porch, I heard the well's voice one last time. You can't run forever, Jake. Sooner or later, you'll have to face what you've done. I slammed the door behind me, sliding down to sit on the floor, my head in my hands. The memory of that night played on repeat in my mind, every detail crystal clear. I don't know how long I sat there lost in the past, but when I finally looked up, I knew what I had to do. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and did a search I should have done years ago. Hit and run accident, Virginia, 2018. The results loaded, and there she was. Emily Parker, 23 years old. A recent college graduate with her whole life ahead of her. The article described how she'd been found on the side of the road, the victim of a hit and run. The case was still unsolved. I clicked on a link to a more recent article, and my blood ran cold. Emily's parents had never given up hope of finding the person responsible for their daughter's death. They'd recently hired a private investigator to look into the case. As I read, a notification popped up on my phone. A new email. With trembling fingers, I opened it. It was from an address I didn't recognize, but the subject line made my heart stop. We know what you did, Jake Connor. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The well knew. And now it seemed someone else did too. My carefully constructed life was beginning to crumble around me. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows across my living room, I realized that my time was running out. I couldn't hide from the truth any longer. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The email glared at me from my phone screen. Its subject line, a damning accusation. We know what you did, Jake Connor. My finger hovered over it, trembling. Did I dare open it? What more could it reveal about my crime? Before I could decide, a sharp knock at the door made me jump, nearly dropping the phone. My heart raced as I approached the door, half expecting to see the sheriff or worse, FBI agents ready to arrest me. Instead, I found myself face to face with Linda Johnson, her round face creased with concern. Jake, dear, she said, her voice gentle. I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. I just wanted to check on you after the sheriff's visit this morning. I forced a smile, trying to appear normal despite the chaos raging inside me. That's very kind of you, Linda. I'm fine, really, just a misunderstanding. She peered at me, unconvinced. Are you sure? You look awfully pale, and your hands are shaking. I glanced down, realizing she was right. I shoved my hands into my pockets. Just a bit under the weather. Nothing to worry about. Linda's eyes narrowed slightly. Jake, I hope you know you can talk to me if something's bothering you. We may be new neighbors, but I'm a good listener. For a moment, I was tempted. The urge to confess, to unburden myself of this terrible secret, was almost overwhelming. But I couldn't. Not to Linda, not to anyone. I appreciate that, Linda, really, but I'm okay. Just need some rest. She nodded, though I could see she wasn't entirely satisfied. All right, dear, but remember, you're part of our community now. Don't be a stranger. As I closed the door, guilt gnawed at me. Linda's kindness only made me feel worse about the lie I was living. I turned back to my phone, steeling myself to open the email. But as I unlocked the screen, a new notification popped up. A voicemail from an unknown number. With shaking hands, I played the message. Mr. Connor, this is David Reeves, private investigator. I'm calling regarding the Emily Parker case. I have some questions I'd like to ask you. Please call me back at this number at your earliest convenience. The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor. They knew. Somehow they had connected me to Emily's death. My mind raced. How? Had someone seen me that night? Had I left some evidence behind? Panic rising in my throat, I rushed to my laptop. I had to know what they knew, had to find out how close they were to the truth. I spent the next few hours scouring the internet for any information on the Emily Parker case. News articles, forum discussions, social media posts. I read it all, my anxiety growing with each passing minute. One article caught my eye. It mentioned that the police had found paint chips at the scene, presumably from the vehicle that had struck Emily. My stomach churned as I remembered the damage to my car that I had so carefully repaired. As night fell, I found myself pacing the living room, my mind a whirlwind of fear and guilt. The walls seemed to be closing in. I needed air. Almost without conscious thought, I found myself walking towards the well. The night was eerily still, no breeze, no chirping crickets, just silence. I approached the well, my footsteps loud in the quiet night. "Are you happy now?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is this what you wanted?" For a long moment there was nothing. Then, a whisper. "The truth will set you free, Jake." I laughed bitterly. "Free? I'll go to prison. I'll lose everything." "You've already lost everything that matters," the well replied. "Your peace of mind, your integrity, your soul." The truth of those words hit me like a physical blow. I sank to my knees, tears streaming down my face. "What do I do?" I whispered. "How do I fix this?" But the well remained silent, offering no easy answers. As I knelt there, lost in my despair, a new sound broke the silence. A car engine, growing louder. Headlights swept across the yard as a vehicle pulled into my driveway. Panic surged through me. Had the police come for me? Was this the end? I scrambled to my feet, ready to run, though I knew it was futile. But as the car door opened, I recognized the figure that stepped out. "Kate?" I called out, disbelief coloring my voice. My sister hurried towards me, her face a mask of worry. "Jake, what the hell is going on? I've been trying to reach you all day." As she got closer, she took in my disheveled appearance, my tear-stained face. "Oh, Jake," she said softly. "What have you done?" The dam broke. Words poured out of me in a torrent. The accident, the cover-up, the years of guilt, and now the well and its whispers. Kate listened in stunned silence, her eyes widening with each revelation. When I finally fell silent, exhausted, Kate took a deep breath. "Jake, this is serious. You need to turn yourself in." "I can't," I whispered. "I'm scared, Kate." She grabbed my shoulders, forcing me to look at her. "Listen to me. You can't run from this anymore. It's eating you alive. And now with this investigation, Jake, it's only a matter of time before they figure it out." I knew she was right, but the thought of confessing, of facing the consequences of what I'd done, terrified me. "What about Mom and Dad?" I asked, my voice small. "It'll kill them." Kate's eyes softened. "They love you, Jake. Yes, they'll be hurt and disappointed, but they'd rather know the truth than see you destroy yourself like this." We stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging between us. Finally, I nodded. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it. I'll turn myself in." Relief flooded Kate's face. She pulled me into a tight hug. "It's the right thing to do, Jake. I'll be with you every step of the way." As we walked back to the house, I felt a strange mix of terror and relief. The path ahead would be hard, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Just before we reached the porch, I glanced back at the well. In the moonlight, I could have sworn I saw a faint smile on the weathered stone. Inside, I sat at my desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. "I should write to Emily's parents," I said. "They deserve to know the truth directly from me." Kate nodded, squeezing my shoulder supportively. "That's a good idea. Do you want me to give you some privacy?" I shook my head. "No, please stay. I don't think I can do this alone. Taking a deep breath, I began to write. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Parker, you don't know me, but 5 years ago I destroyed your lives. I am the person responsible for your daughter Emily's death. The words flowed, painful but cathartic. As I wrote, I felt the weight I'd been carrying for 5 years begin to lift. It wasn't gone. I knew I would carry the guilt of what I'd done for the rest of my life, but for the first time it felt bearable. When I finished, I looked up at Kate, tears in my eyes. What happens now? She took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. Now we face this together. First thing tomorrow, we'll go to the police station. I'll be right there with you. I nodded, a mix of fear and resolve settling in my chest. As we sat there, the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. A new day was beginning, and with it, a new chapter in my life. Whatever came next, arrest, trial, imprisonment, I would face it. I owed it to Emily, to her family, and to myself. As the sun rose, casting a warm glow over the room, I heard the Wells whisper one last time. The truth has set you free, Jake. Now make it count. I looked out the window at the old well, standing silent in the morning light. For the first time since I'd moved in, it didn't fill me with dread. Instead, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. It had forced me to confront my past, to face the truth I'd been running from for so long. And in doing so, it had given me a chance at redemption. The road ahead would be hard, but as I sat there with my sister, watching the new day dawn, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally on the right path. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, their harsh glare making me feel exposed and vulnerable. Kate sat beside me, her hand resting reassuringly on my arm as we waited. The hard plastic chair dug into my back, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil raging inside me. Jake Connor? A gruff voice called out. I looked up to see a detective approaching, his face a mask of professional neutrality. I'm Detective Simmons. Follow me, please. As I stood, Kate squeezed my arm. Do you want me to come with you? I shook my head. No, I need to do this alone. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. I'll be right here when you're done. The walk to the interrogation room felt like a march to the gallows. Each step brought me closer to the moment I'd been dreading for 5 years. As we entered the small, stark room, Detective Simmons gestured for me to sit. Mr. Connor, he began, his voice level. You asked to speak with us about the Emily Parker case. What can you tell me? I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I placed them on the cold metal table. I'm the one who hit her. I'm responsible for Emily Parker's death. The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Detective Simmons's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, in his eyes. That's a serious confession, Mr. Connor. Are you sure you don't want a lawyer present? I shook my head. No. I've been running from this for too long. I need to tell the truth. What followed was the most difficult conversation of my life. I recounted every detail of that fateful night. The rain, the alcohol, the sickening thud of impact. I described my panic, my shameful decision to flee, the years of guilt and fear that followed. As I spoke, Detective Simmons took notes, occasionally asking for clarification. His face remained impassive, but I could sense his growing tension. When I finally fell silent, emotionally drained, he leaned back in his chair. Mr. Connor, do you understand the gravity of what you're confessing to? Hit and run resulting in death is a felony. You're looking at significant jail time. I nodded, a strange sense of calm settling over me. I understand. I'm ready to face the consequences of what I've done. Detective Simmons stood. Wait here. I need to discuss this with the district attorney. As the door closed behind him, the reality of my situation began to sink in. This was it. There was no going back now. I thought of my parents, of my job, of the life I'd built. All of it would be gone. But beneath the fear and regret, there was also a glimmer of something else. Relief. The burden I'd carried for so long was finally lifting. Hours passed in a blur of questions, paperwork, and phone calls. I was fingerprinted, photographed, formally charged. Through it all, Kate remained a steady presence, her unwavering support the only thing keeping me grounded. As night fell, I found myself in a holding cell, waiting to be transferred to the county jail. Kate stood on the other side of the bars, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I called Mom and Dad," she said softly. "They're in shock, but they're on their way. They want you to know they love you no matter what." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "Jake," Kate continued, her voice breaking slightly, "I'm proud of you. What you did today, it took incredible courage." I managed a weak smile. "I don't feel very courageous. I feel terrified." "That's what makes it brave," she replied. "You did the right thing even though it was the hardest thing in the world." As Kate left, promising to return in the morning, I lay on the hard cot, staring at the ceiling. Sleep seemed impossible, my mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. The trial, sentencing, prison. It was overwhelming. In the quiet of the cell, I found myself thinking of the well. Had it all been in my head? A manifestation of my guilt? Or was there really something supernatural at work? As if in answer to my unspoken questions, I heard a familiar whisper. "You've taken the first step, Jake. But your journey isn't over." I sat up, looking around the empty cell. "What do you mean? What more can I do?" The whisper came again, soft but clear. "Redemption isn't found in punishment alone. It's in what you do with the time you're given." Before I could respond, the voice faded, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of legal proceedings. I was assigned a public defender, a tired-looking woman named Sarah Jeffries. She didn't sugarcoat things. "With your confession and the evidence they have, fighting this in court would be futile," she explained during our first meeting. "Our best option is to negotiate a plea deal. Show remorse, emphasize that you turned yourself in. We might be able to get the sentence reduced." I nodded, still somewhat numb to it all. "What about Emily's family? Will they be at the hearing?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Yes, they will. They've been notified of your confession. Mr. Connor, Jake, they may want to speak to you." The thought filled me with equal parts dread and desperate hope. What could I possibly say to the people whose lives I'd destroyed? The day of my arraignment arrived all too soon. As I stood before the judge entering my guilty plea, I was acutely aware of the people sitting in the gallery behind me. My parents, their faces etched with pain and confusion. Kate, her chin lifted defiantly, supporting me despite everything. And there, on the other side, a couple I assumed were Emily's parents. The woman was crying silently, while the man stared at me with a mixture of anger and something I couldn't quite identify. As the judge set a date for sentencing and I was led away, I heard a commotion behind me. "Wait!" a voice called out. "Please, I need to speak with him." I turned to see Emily's mother approaching, her husband close behind. The bailiff moved to intercept them, but the judge waved him off. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," the judge said gently, "you'll have an opportunity to speak at the sentencing hearing." "Please," Mrs. Parker insisted, her eyes locked on me. "Just for a moment." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Bailiff, escort Mr. Connor and the Parkers to a private room. 5 minutes." Heart pounding, I followed the bailiff, the Parkers close behind. As we entered a small conference room, I found myself face to face with the people I'd wronged so terribly. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, to my utter shock, Mrs. Parker stepped forward and embraced me. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for telling the truth." I stood frozen, unable to comprehend her reaction. As she stepped back, Mr. Parker spoke. his voice gruff with suppressed emotion. "We've spent 5 years wondering, imagining, hating the faceless person who took our daughter from us," he said. "And now we know. It doesn't bring Emily back, but we can start to heal," Mrs. Parker finished. "Knowing the truth, seeing that you're truly remorseful, it helps." Tears streamed down my face as I struggled to find words. "I'm so sorry," I managed finally. "I know it's not enough, it can never be enough, but I am so sorry for what I did." Mr. Parker nodded, his expression conflicted. "We can't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But we're grateful you came forward. It's more than we ever expected." As they turned to leave, Mrs. Parker paused. "Emily believed in second chances," she said softly. "Whatever sentence you receive, Mr. Connor, please, make it count. Do something good with your life. For Emily." As the door closed behind them, I sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the unexpected grace I'd just witnessed. The Parkers' words echoed in my mind, mingling with the whispers from the well. Redemption, second chances, making it count. In that moment, as I waited to be led back to my cell, I made a vow. Whatever time I had left, whether behind bars or beyond, I would dedicate it to honoring Emily's memory, to becoming the kind of person who deserved the second chance I'd been given. The path ahead was still daunting, filled with challenges I could barely imagine. But for the first time since that rainy night 5 years ago, I felt a spark of hope. The well had forced me to face my past. Now, it was up to me to shape my future. The days leading up to my sentencing hearing blurred together in a haze of legal consultations and sleepless nights. I'd been released on bail, thanks to my parents mortgaging their house. The freedom felt more like a curse than a blessing, each moment outside a reminder of the life I was about to lose. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring blankly at a stack of legal documents, when a sharp knock at the door jolted me back to reality. My heart raced as I approached the door. These days, every unexpected visitor felt like a harbinger of doom. I opened the door to find two men in suits, their expressions serious and professional. "Jake Connor," the taller of the two asked, flashing a badge. "I'm Detective Reeves, and this is my partner, Detective Morales. We're with the state police. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your confession." My mouth went dry. I've already told the local police everything. My lawyer said, "We understand, Mr. Connor." Detective Morales interrupted smoothly. "But some new information has come to light. We just need to clarify a few details." I hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let them in. As they settled onto my couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Detective Reeves pulled out a notebook. "Mr. Connor, in your confession, you stated that you were alone in the car on the night of Emily Parker's death. Is that correct?" "Yes," I replied, my voice shaking slightly. "It was just me." Morales leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Are you absolutely certain about that, Mr. Connor? Because we have a witness who claims they saw two people in the car that hit Emily." The room seemed to tilt around me. That's impossible. There was no one else. I was alone." Reeves and Morales exchanged a look. "Mr. Connor," Reeves said slowly, "we have reason to believe you might be covering for someone. If that's the case, now is the time to come clean. Protecting an accomplice will only make things worse for you." "I'm not protecting anyone," I insisted, panic rising in my throat. "I told the truth. I was alone. I hit Emily. I drove away. It was just me." Morales sighed, pulling out a file. "We've been looking into your background, Mr. Connor, your movements in the days following the accident, and we found something interesting." He slid a photograph across the coffee table. It showed me, 5 years younger, sitting in a bar with a woman I barely remembered. "This was taken 2 days after Emily Parker's death," Morales continued. "The woman is Melissa Hawkins. Ring any bells?" I stared at the photo, memories slowly surfacing. I think I remember her. We met at the bar. talked for a while, but she had nothing to do with the accident. I didn't even know her before that night. Reeves leaned back, his expression skeptical. That's not what Melissa says. She claims you were distraught that night, that you confided in her about a terrible mistake you'd made. She says you told her you weren't alone in the car. My mind reeled. That's not... I never said that. I was drinking, yes. I probably said some things I shouldn't have, but I never told her about the accident. And I certainly never said I wasn't alone because I was. The detectives continued their questioning, probing for inconsistencies, trying to trip me up. But I held firm to the truth, even as doubt and confusion clouded my mind. Finally, after what felt like hours, they stood to leave. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Connor?" Reeves said, his tone ominous. "I suggest you think very carefully about what you've told us. If we find out you've been lying..." As the door closed behind them, I collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands. What was happening? Had I somehow misremembered that night? No, that was impossible. I knew what had happened. I had lived with the guilt of it for 5 years. But then why would this Melissa person lie? And who was the witness who claimed to have seen 2 people in the car? My thoughts were interrupted by the shrill ring of my phone. It was Kate. "Jake, are you okay? You sound terrible." I took a shaky breath. "Kate, I think I'm in trouble. The police were just here. State detectives. They're saying I might not have been alone in the car that night." "What?" Kate's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Jake, that's ridiculous. You told me everything. I know you were alone." I know, but they have a witness, Kate. And this woman, someone I apparently met a few days after. She's saying I told her things I know I never said." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jake?" Kate said finally, her voice low and serious. "Listen to me. You need to call your lawyer right now. Don't talk to anyone else about this. Not the police, not me, not anyone. Understand?" I nodded, then remembered she couldn't see me. Yeah, I understand." After hanging up, I immediately called Sarah Jeffries, my public defender. She listened to my account of the detective's visit, her voice growing increasingly concerned. "Jake, this is serious," she said when I finished. "If they can cast doubt on your confession, if they can suggest you were covering for someone else, it could complicate everything. We need to meet. First thing tomorrow morning, my office." That night, sleep eluded me entirely. I paced my house, replaying every moment of that terrible night 5 years ago. I was certain I had been alone. So why did I feel a nagging doubt in the back of my mind? As dawn broke, I found myself standing in front of the well. Its weathered stone seemed to mock me in the pale morning light. "What's happening?" I whispered. I told the truth. I came clean. Why is this happening now? For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, so faint I almost missed it, came the whisper. "The truth is never simple, Jake. Dig deeper." I frowned. What does that mean? What am I missing? But the well remained stubbornly silent. My meeting with Sarah was tense and frustrating. She grilled me on every detail of that night, searching for any inconsistency, any gap in my memory that could explain the new allegations. "Jake," she said finally, leaning back in her chair, "I believe you. But this complicates things. If the prosecution gets wind of this, they could argue that your confession was false or incomplete. It could void our plea deal. So what do we do?" I asked, feeling helpless. Sarah's expression was grim. "We need to do our own investigation. Find out who this witness is, track down this Melissa woman. We need to understand where these claims are coming from before we can counter them." As I left Sarah's office, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at Riverside Park, 3 p.m. Come alone. I know the truth about that night." My hand shook as I stared at the message. Who could it be? Melissa? The mysterious witness? Or someone else entirely? I knew I should tell Sarah, should probably ignore the message altogether. but the well's words echoed in my mind. Dig deeper. At 2:55 p.m., I found myself walking into Riverside Park, my heart pounding with each step. The park was mostly empty, a few joggers and dog walkers scattered here and there. As I approached the designated meeting spot, a bench overlooking the river, I saw a figure already seated there. A woman, her face hidden by large sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat. I sat down beside her, my mouth dry. "I got your message," I said quietly. "Who are you? What do you know about that night?" The woman turned to me, slowly removing her sunglasses. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized her. It was Linda Johnson, my neighbor from the old house. "Hello, Jake," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think it's time we had a talk about what really happened the night Emily Parker died." As Linda began to speak, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Everything I thought I knew, everything I had confessed to, was about to be turned upside down. The truth, it seemed, was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. The world seemed to slow down as I stared at Linda, my neighbor from the old house, sitting next to me on the park bench. The gentle lapping of the river against the shore and the distant chatter of park-goers faded into white noise as I struggled to process her words. "What do you mean, what really happened?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Linda's hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. She looked older than I remembered, lines of worry etched deeply into her face. "Jake," she began, her voice quavering. "I've been carrying this secret for 5 years and I can't do it anymore. Not after seeing what it's done to you. What you're going through now." My heart raced as I leaned in closer, hanging on her every word. "That night," Linda continued, "the night Emily Parker died, I was there." The admission hit me like a physical blow. I recoiled, nearly falling off the bench. "What? No, that's impossible. I was alone. I know I was alone." Linda shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "You weren't alone, Jake. I was in the passenger seat." My mind reeled, desperately trying to make sense of her words. Flashes of that rainy night played through my head, but try as I might, I couldn't picture Linda there. "I don't understand," I said, my voice rising with panic. "Why don't I remember this? Why are you only coming forward now?" Linda took a deep breath, seeming to steel herself for what she was about to say. "Because I made you forget, Jake, or at least I tried to." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small vial filled with clear liquid. "Do you know what this is?" I shook my head, a growing sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. "It's a powerful sedative," Linda explained. "Mixed with alcohol, it can cause blackouts and memory loss. That night after the accident, I put it in your drink." The world tilted around me as the implications of her words sank in. "You drugged me?" I whispered, horror and disbelief warring in my voice. Linda nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I panicked, Jake. We both did. But you were talking about turning yourself in, about confessing everything. I couldn't let that happen. I had too much to lose." As Linda spoke, fragmented memories began to surface. The rain-slicked road, the sickening thud of impact, and Linda's voice, high and panicked. "Oh God, Jake, what have we done?" "We were having an affair," Linda continued, her voice barely audible. "That's why we were out that night. We'd been drinking, arguing about whether to tell Frank and end our marriages. You were distracted, driving too fast." I felt sick, memories I didn't know I had flooding back. The secret meetings, the stolen kisses, the guilt that had eaten away at me even before that fateful night. "When we hit Emily," Linda went on, "you wanted to stop, to call for help. But I was terrified. I begged you to keep driving. And you did. God help me, you did." I remembered now. The argument in the car, Linda's hysterical pleas, my own panic and indecision. "After we got back to your house," Linda said, "you were beside yourself with guilt. You kept saying we needed to go to the police. That's when I put the drug in your whiskey." She looked at me, her eyes pleading for understanding. I told myself I was protecting us both, that it was better if you didn't remember, if you thought you'd been alone. I never imagined you'd carry that guilt all on your own for so long. I sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this new reality with the narrative I'd believed for 5 years. The guilt, the nightmares, the confession I'd made. It had all been based on a lie. "Why now?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse. "Why are you telling me this now?" Linda wiped her eyes, her shoulders sagging with the weight of her confession. "When I heard about your arrest, about your confession, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. And then when the detectives started asking questions, mentioning a witness who saw 2 people, you were the witness," I realized, the pieces falling into place. She nodded. "I couldn't let you take the fall alone, Jake. Not anymore. It's time for the whole truth to come out." As Linda's words sank in, a maelstrom of emotion swept through me. Anger at her deception, relief at finally understanding the gaps in my memory, and a renewed sense of guilt and horror at what we'd done. "We need to go to the police," I said, standing up abruptly. "We need to tell them everything." Linda's eyes widened in fear. "Jake, please. Think about what this will do to our families, to Frank, to your parents." I shook my head, a strange calm settling over me. "No, Linda. No more lies. No more cover-ups. We owe it to Emily and her family to tell the truth. The whole truth." As we made our way to the police station, my mind raced with the implications of what was about to happen. My confession would need to be amended, the plea deal possibly renegotiated, and Linda would face her own charges. The next few hours passed in a blur of statements, questions, and legal consultations. My lawyer, Sarah, looked shell-shocked as she listened to our revised account of that night. "This changes everything," she muttered, scribbling furious notes. "The prosecution will have a field day with this." As night fell, I found myself back in a holding cell, the events of the day swirling in my mind. Linda was in another part of the station, likely going through her own interrogation. In the quiet of the cell, I heard a now familiar whisper. "The truth will set you free, Jake. But first, it will shatter everything you thought you knew." I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cool concrete wall. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked the empty air. "Why lead me to confess if you knew it wasn't the whole truth?" The whisper came again, soft but clear. "Some truths can only be discovered, not told. You needed to find your way to this moment." I pondered those words as exhaustion finally overtook me. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, I thought about the long road ahead. The amended charges, the new trial, the reactions of our families when they learned the full story. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was also a glimmer of something else. A sense of clarity, of a weight finally lifting. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like I could breathe. The truth had indeed shattered everything. But from those shattered pieces, perhaps something new could be built. Something based on honesty, on taking true responsibility for our actions. As dawn broke, casting long shadows through the bars of my cell, I made a silent vow. To Emily, to her family, to myself. No more lies, no more hiding. Whatever came next, I would face it with the full truth, no matter how painful. The well had led me here, through a twisted path of half-truths and buried memories. Now it was up to me to see this journey through to its end. As I was led out for another round of questioning, I caught a glimpse of Linda being escorted down the hall. Our eyes met for a brief moment, a lifetime of secrets and regrets passing between us. Then the moment passed and we were led in separate directions. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with legal and personal challenges. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was walking in the light of truth. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, the real story of that tragic night would finally be told. The courtroom was a sea of tension, the air thick with anticipation and barely suppressed emotion. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide their trembling. To my left, Linda Johnson sat, her face a mask of stoic resignation. We hadn't spoken since that day in the park, our only communication filtered through lawyers and legal proceedings. As the bailiff called the court to order, I risked a glance behind me. My parents sat in the front row, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion, disappointment, and unwavering love. Beside them, Kate offered a small, encouraging smile. On the other side of the aisle, I saw Frank Johnson, Linda's husband. His face was a storm of anger and betrayal, and there, just behind him, sat Mr. and Mrs. Parker, Emily's parents. Their presence was a constant reminder of why we were here, of the life we had taken and the years of deception that followed. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, peered down at us over her glasses. "We're here today for the sentencing of Jake Connor and Linda Johnson in the matter of the death of Emily Parker. Before I pass sentence, is there anything either of the defendants would like to say?" My lawyer nudged me gently and I stood on shaky legs. I had prepared a statement, had rehearsed it countless times, but as I faced the courtroom, the words fled my mind. Instead, I turned to face the Parkers directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," I began, my voice cracking with emotion. "I know that nothing I say can bring Emily back or undo the pain we've caused you. For 5 years I lived with the guilt of what I believed was my solitary crime. But the truth, as you now know, is far worse." I paused, taking a shaky breath. "We didn't just take Emily's life that night. We compounded that terrible act with years of lies and cowardice. I can't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that not a day will go by for the rest of my life that I won't think of Emily and strive to honor her memory by being a better person than I was that night." As I sat down, I heard muffled sobs from the gallery. Whether they were from Emily's parents or my own, I couldn't tell. Linda stood next, her voice barely above a whisper as she delivered her own apology. As she spoke of her role in the cover-up, of the drugs she used to make me forget, I saw Frank Johnson storm out of the courtroom, unable to bear hearing more. The judge listened impassively to our statements, then to the impassioned pleas of the prosecution and the measured arguments of our defense. Finally, she cleared her throat, silencing the courtroom. "Jake Connor and Linda Johnson," she began, her voice stern, "the crimes you have committed are severe. Not only did your reckless actions result in the death of a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, but you then engaged in a years-long deception to avoid the consequences of your actions." She paused, her gaze moving between Linda and me. "However, the court does recognize that you both eventually came forward with the truth, sparing the Parker family and the state the ordeal of a prolonged trial. Taking this into account, along with your expressions of remorse, I hereby sentence you both to 12 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. The gavel came down with a resounding crack, sealing our fate. As the bailiffs moved to lead us away, chaos erupted in the courtroom. I heard my mother's anguished cry, saw Kate trying to comfort her. Linda's sobs echoed through the room as she was handcuffed. Just before I was led through the side door, I caught one last glimpse of the Parkers. Mrs. Parker was weeping silently, her husband's arm around her shoulders. But it was Mr. Parker's expression that struck me. A mix of grief, anger, and something that looked almost like relief. The long nightmare of not knowing was over for them, even if the pain would never truly end. The next few hours passed in a blur of processing and transport. Before I knew it, I was standing in a stark cell, the harsh clang of the door closing behind me echoing in my ears. This would be my home for the next decade or more of my life. As night fell and the prison settled into its routine, I lay on the hard bunk, staring at the ceiling. The events of the past few months played through my mind like a surreal movie. The whispers from the well, my initial confession, Linda's revelation, and finally, today's sentencing. Just as I was drifting into an uneasy sleep, I heard it, a faint whisper, somehow audible even through the thick prison walls. "The truth has been told, Jake, but your journey is far from over." I sat up, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" I whispered into the darkness. "What more can there be?" The voice came again, as cryptic as ever. Redemption is not found in punishment alone, but in how you use the time you're given. Remember Emily. Honor her memory. As the whisper faded, I was left with a strange mix of emotions. Fear of the years ahead, guilt over the pain I'd caused, but also a glimmer of purpose. The next morning, I was introduced to the realities of prison life. The strict schedules, the loss of privacy, the constant underlying tension. As I stood in line for breakfast, a burly inmate behind me growled, "What are you in for, pretty boy?" I hesitated, then decided on honesty. Vehicular manslaughter and a cover-up. The man grunted. Least you owned up to it eventually, more than most of these lowlifes would do. As the days turned into weeks, I slowly adjusted to my new life. I threw myself into every program the prison offered: counseling, education, work assignments, anything to keep my mind occupied and to feel like I was making some kind of progress, however small. One day, about a month into my sentence, I received a visitor I never expected, Mr. Parker, Emily's father. We sat across from each other in the visitation room, the weight of our shared history hanging heavy between us. "I don't really know why I'm here," Mr. Parker began, his voice gruff with emotion. "Part of me still hates you for what you did, but I needed to see you, to try to understand." I nodded, unable to find words adequate for the moment. "Emily," Mr. Parker continued, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She always believed in second chances, in redemption. It's taken me a long time, but I'm trying to honor that part of her." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed a young woman with Emily's smile, surrounded by a group of children. "This was taken a month before she died," Mr. Parker explained. "Emily was volunteering at a literacy program for underprivileged kids. It was her passion." He slid the photo across the table to me. "I want you to have this, to remember her not just as the person as the victim, but as who she really was, the lives she touched." I took the photo with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the unexpected gesture. "Mr. Parker, He held up a hand, cutting me off. "I'm not saying I forgive you. I don't know if I ever can. But Emily would have wanted her death to mean something. So I'm asking you, no, I'm challenging you, to make something good come out of this. To live the rest of your life in a way that would make her proud." As Mr. Parker left, his words echoed in my mind, intertwining with the whispers from the well. For the first time since my imprisonment, I felt a real sense of purpose forming. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I made a decision. I would use every day of my sentence to better myself, to learn, to grow. And when I got out, I would dedicate my life to continuing Emily's work, helping children, spreading literacy, making a positive difference in the world. It wouldn't erase what I'd done. Nothing ever could. But perhaps in some small way it could help balance the scales. As I drifted off to sleep, I heard the whisper one last time. "Now you understand, Jake. This is how you honor her memory. This is how you find redemption." And for the first time in years, I slept without nightmares, the path ahead finally clear. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered to life, signaling the start of another day. I blinked awake, the familiar sounds of the prison stirring around me. It had been 3 years since that fateful day in court. 3 years of routine, reflection, and gradual change. As I swung my legs over the side of my bunk, my cellmate, Rodriguez, grunted a greeting. "Morning, Connor. Big day today, huh?" I nodded, a mix of nervousness and excitement churning in my stomach. "Yeah. First day of the new literacy program." After months of proposal writing, meetings with the warden, and jumping through bureaucratic hoops, I had finally gotten approval to start a literacy program for inmates. It felt like a small step towards fulfilling the promise I'd made to Mr. Parker and to myself. As I made my way to the prison library, which had been cleared for our use, I couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. The room was already half full when I arrived, a dozen inmates seated at tables, looking equal parts curious and skeptical. I cleared my throat, willing my voice not to shake. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jake Connor, and I'll be facilitating this literacy program. Before we start, I want to thank you all for being here. I know it's not easy to admit when you need help, especially in a place like this. But learning to read, to truly understand and communicate through words, it's freedom. It's power. As I spoke, I saw a few nods, a couple of eye rolls, but mostly just attentive faces. I continued. I'm not here to judge anyone. I'm here because I made a promise to try and do some good in the world, to honor someone who can't be here herself. So let's get started, shall we? The next 2 hours flew by as we worked through basic phonics and simple sentences. By the end of the session, I saw a glimmer of pride in some of the men's eyes as they successfully read their first complete paragraph. As the inmates filed out, one of them, a young man named Tyrell, hung back. Hey, Connor, he said, his voice low. I just wanted to say, thanks, man. I've been too embarrassed to tell anyone I can't read. But the way you talked about it, like it's not something to be ashamed of, it helped. I felt a lump form in my throat. You're welcome, Tyrell. See you next week? He nodded, a small smile on his face as he left. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't experienced in years. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like a start. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it. The familiar whisper, somehow audible even through the prison walls. You're on the right path, Jake, but there's still more to learn, more to understand. I sat up, my heart racing. It had been years since I'd heard the voice. What do you mean? I whispered into the darkness. What more is there? The voice came again, as enigmatic as ever. The truth has many layers. You've uncovered some, but not all. Keep digging. Before I could ask for clarification, the whisper faded, leaving me with a sense of unease. What more could there be to uncover? The next morning, I was surprised to be called to the visitation room. As I entered, I saw a familiar face, Detective Reeves, one of the state police officers who had questioned me years ago. Mr. Connor, he said, gesturing for me to sit. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I sat down, curiosity and apprehension warring within me. What's this about, Detective? Reeves leaned forward, his expression serious. We've reopened the investigation into Emily Parker's death. I felt the blood drain from my face. What? Why? Linda and I confessed. We're serving our time. New evidence has come to light, Reeves explained. Evidence that suggests there might have been more to the story than what you and Mrs. Johnson told us. My mind reeled. I don't understand. We told you everything. What new evidence? Reeves pulled out a file, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed a stretch of road I recognized all too well, the scene of the accident. But something was off. This photo was taken by a traffic camera about 2 minutes before the estimated time of Emily Parker's death, Reeves said. Look closely. I peered at the image and suddenly I saw it. There, in the background, was a third car, a car I didn't remember seeing that night. We've enhanced the image, Reeves continued. The license plate is partially visible. We've traced it to a Thomas Grayson. Does that name mean anything to you? I shook my head, still struggling to process this new information. No, I've never heard of him. Are you saying someone else was involved? Reeves leaned back, his eyes never leaving my face. That's what we're trying to figure out, Mr. Connor. We've spoken to Mrs. Johnson as well. She claims no knowledge of this third car or Mr. Grayson, but given the history of deception in this case. He left the sentence hanging, the implication clear. They weren't sure if they could trust our word anymore. I swear, I said, my voice shaking. I'm not lying. If there was another car there that night, I don't remember it, unless... A terrible thought occurred to me. The drug, I whispered. The one Linda gave me to make me forget. Could it have made me forget more than just her presence? Reeves nodded slowly. It's possible. Which is why we're here, Mr. Connor. We need your help. We need you to try and remember anything at all, that might shed light on this new development. As Reeves left, promising to return in a few days, my mind was in turmoil. The whispers from the night before suddenly took on new meaning. The truth has many layers, it had said. Was this what it meant? Over the next few days, I threw myself into trying to recover any lost memories. I meditated. I wrote down every fragment I could recall from that night. I even requested sessions with the prison psychologist to try hypnotherapy. Slowly, maddeningly slowly, pieces began to come back. Flashes of memory, snippets of conversation I'd forgotten. I remembered an argument not just between Linda and me, but involving a third voice. A man's voice, angry and threatening. I remembered the screech of tires, not just from our car, but from another, speeding away from the scene. And I remembered a name, whispered urgently by Linda just before she drugged me. We can't tell anyone about Tom. He'll kill us both. As these memories surfaced, I felt a growing sense of horror. What really happened that night? Who was Tom Grayson and what role did he play in Emily's death? When Detective Reeves returned, I told him everything I'd remembered. His face grew increasingly grim as I spoke. Mr. Connor, he said when I'd finished, I believe you've just blown this case wide open. We'll need to bring Mrs. Johnson in for further questioning, and we'll be looking into this Tom Grayson very closely. As he stood to leave, Reeves paused. You know, this could potentially affect your sentence. If it turns out you weren't as directly responsible as we thought. I shook my head. That doesn't matter. What matters is finding out the whole truth, for Emily's sake and for her family. That night, as I lay in my bunk, my mind racing with the implications of these new revelations, I heard the whisper one last time. Well done, Jake. You're closer to the truth now than ever before. But remember, the journey isn't over. True redemption lies not just in uncovering the past, but in what you do with that knowledge. As the whisper faded, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever the truth turned out to be, whatever consequences it might bring, I knew one thing for certain. I would see this through to the end. For Emily, for her family, and for the man I was trying to become. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential dangers and revelations. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The truth in all its complexity was finally within reach. The gates of the prison loomed before me, a sight I'd seen countless times over the past 5 years. But today was different. Today they were opening to let me out. My early release, granted due to the new evidence in Emily's case and my cooperation with the ongoing investigation, felt surreal. As I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, a free man for the first time in half a decade, I was overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions, relief, anxiety, and a deep-seated determination to see this through to the end. Kate was waiting for me, her face a mix of joy and concern. As she hugged me tightly, I felt a lump form in my throat. "Welcome back, little brother," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The drive back to my old neighborhood was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. As we turned onto the familiar street, I saw it, my old house, the scene of so many nightmares and whispered truths. "Are you sure about this, Jake?" Kate asked, concern evident in her voice. "You don't have to go back there. We could find you a place in the city near me." I shook my head, my resolve firm. "No, I need to do this. I need to face it all. The memories, the truth, whatever's left to uncover." As we pulled into the driveway, I saw a figure standing near the old well. My heart raced as I recognized him. Mr. Parker, Emily's father. I approached him slowly, unsure of my welcome. His face was a mask of complex emotions, grief, anger, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Mr. Parker," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect to see you here." He nodded, his eyes never leaving my face. "I heard you were being released today. I needed to see you, to talk to you face to face." Kate, sensing the intensity of the moment, quietly excused herself and went inside the house. Mr. Parker and I stood in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared history hanging heavy between us. Finally, he spoke. "I've been following the investigation, Jake. This man, Tom Grayson, they found him." My breath caught in my throat. "They did? When?" "Last week," Mr. Parker replied. "He confessed to everything. It turns out he was blackmailing Linda, threatening to expose your affair if she didn't help him cover up his own involvement in the accident." The world seemed to tilt around me as the implications of this revelation sank in. "So, that night?" Mr. Parker nodded, his voice tight with emotion. "Grayson was drunk, driving recklessly. He hit Emily first, then swerved into your lane, causing you to hit her as well. He used his connections to bury the evidence and use Linda's fear to keep you both quiet." I felt my knees give way, sinking to the ground as the full truth finally came to light. All these years, all the guilt and self-recrimination, and we hadn't even known the whole story. "I'm so sorry," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "If I had just remembered sooner, if I hadn't let Linda drug me." To my utter shock, Mr. Parker knelt beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Jake, listen to me. What happened that night was a tragedy, a terrible confluence of bad decisions and worse luck. But you've paid for your part in it. You've worked to make amends. And in the end, it was your willingness to keep searching for the truth that brought Grayson to justice." I looked up at him, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. How can you be so understanding, after everything that's happened?" Mr. Parker's eyes filled with tears. "Because Emily would have wanted me to be. Because holding on to anger and blame hasn't brought her back, hasn't made anything better. And because I've seen the man you've become, Jake. The work you've done in prison, the lives you've touched through your literacy program. That matters." As we sat there, the autumn sun warming our faces, I felt a shift in the air. A whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "The circle is complete, Jake. The truth is known. But your journey isn't over. It's just beginning." Mr. Parker looked around, startled. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips despite the emotional weight of the moment. "It's a long story, Mr. Parker. One I'm only now beginning to fully understand myself." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Mr. Parker and I talked, really talked for the first time, about Emily, about the night that changed all our lives, about the years that followed. It was painful, but also cathartic, like lancing a long festering wound. As he prepared to leave, Mr. Parker turned to me one last time. "Jake, I want you to know, I forgive you. It's taken me years to get to this point, but I do. And I think Emily would be proud of the man you're becoming." Those words, more than anything else, broke something open inside me. As Mr. Parker drove away, I wept, not just for Emily, or for the years lost, but for the possibility of redemption I'd never truly believed was possible. That night, as I lay in my old bedroom, surrounded by memories both painful and bittersweet, I heard the whisper one last time. "You've come full circle, Jake. You've faced your past, uncovered the truth, and found forgiveness. But remember, this is not the end. It's a new beginning." In that moment, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I called Detective Reeves. "Detective," I said when he answered, "I want to help with the Grayson case in any way I can. And after that, I want to expand the literacy program, not just in prisons, but in schools and community centers. I want to honor Emily's memory by continuing the work she was passionate about." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "That's a big undertaking, Jake. Are you sure you're ready for it?" I thought about everything that had happened. The accident, the years of guilt, the revelations, and finally, the forgiveness I'd never thought possible. "Yes," I said, my voice firm with conviction. "I'm ready." As I hung up the phone, I walked out to the old well. It stood silent in the morning light, no whispers emanating from its depths, but I didn't need them anymore. The well had guided me to this point, had pushed me to uncover the truth and face my past. Now it was up to me to shape my future. I placed my hand on the cool stone, feeling a sense of closure. "Thank you," I whispered, not sure if I was talking to the well, to Emily's spirit, or to some greater force I didn't fully understand. As I turned back to the house ready to start this new chapter of my life, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But for the first time, I felt truly prepared to face it. The old well in my backyard had started whispering my darkest secrets at night. But in doing so, it had led me to confront those secrets, to uncover deeper truths, and ultimately, to find a path to redemption. My journey had come full circle, and now, a new one was just beginning.